Welcome to Elevate Uplift's Community Dialogue Series, centering healing advocacy and services. The Elevate Uplift project seeks to deepen and broaden the lessons learned from the National Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative project and engage with organizations to change practices and expand their understanding of healing. Elevate Uplift offers opportunities to help survivor-serving agencies, state, territorial, tribal coalitions, and funding administrators to think critically about how they do their work and to make the changes necessary to provide comprehensive and sustainable support for survivors. That includes establishing practices and services rooted in anti-racism and anti-oppression frameworks, learning strategies for building empowering leadership, creating intentional organizational identity, engaging in impactful community organizing and movement building, and expanding knowledge of sexual violence and healing.
But what we're doing together today is really taking a look at this very kind of unfortunate and arbitrary distinction between who gets to be considered a victim and who's considered a quote unquote offender or perpetrator in this country, and why it is that there's sort of a line between the two, and how to kind of deconstruct that line, interrogate that divide, and really kind of acknowledge and consider the fact that there's tremendous overlap between who's been victimized and who's been, a perpetrator of harm or crime, whatever you want to call it. And how do we reorient our system in ways that better addresses all of those survivors of trauma who are kind of falling through the cracks right now and not getting the help that they need because of that really strange and arbitrary divide. So myself, I'm Cynthia Totten from Just Detention International. Annika Leonard is here, and our friend Richard Smith will be on any minute from Common Justice. One of his children had a bloody nose, so he got a little bit tied up with that. But Annika, why don't I turn it over to you to start, and we can get going.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you everyone who has signed up for this topic. I know it's not very often that we get a chance to look at how sexual violence and gender-based violence impacts people who have been criminalized and people who are formerly criminalized. So I love the work that Just Detention is doing, that our colleague Richard is doing, and a number of other organizations. Like it's not a well talked about topic, but has been gaining traction. And I'm just so excited about being able to present you all with some information that, it's come down the pipes. And then that also has been learned firsthand through experiences. So one of the things that I love to do is to, kind of pay respect and send some love and light out. And so what I want to do right now is light a candle. And I am lighting this candle for the fact that we are all in a pandemic and living and breathing survivors of some sort of trauma at some point in our lives. It does not have to be, the surviving sexual violence or domestic violence. We are covering all survivors at this point, including those of us who are surviving COVID, who have lost relatives and loved ones due to COVID, and, survivors who are incarcerated right now and, experiencing high rates of COVID because of lack of space within the facilities that they're being housed in. And so I just want to take a minute and let you all know that I am lifting up all those who are impacted by COVID, by incarceration, by violence, by trauma, by you name it, whatever is causing dis-ease in your heart and in your spirit. Like I'm sending love and light that way. And I like to do that because it also keeps me grounded. I'm a person who, my family members have been incarcerated, have been criminalized. I've been criminalized to some degree at different points in my life, and certainly not to the extent of some of the information I'll be sharing today, but definitely impacted by it. So I just wanted to make sure that I said that, and I lifted up and honored anyone who was experiencing violence in incarceration and criminalization. And so I want to have an opportunity in the chat. If you have someone that you would like to lift up, please definitely add it to the chat. And you're welcome, Rebecca. I think it's very important that we stay grounded in why we're doing what we're doing, right? And so I am going to talk a little bit about like what our experiences are going to be together today. So we're going to talk about like some commonly used terms. I'm going to define victimization, victims criminalization, and we'll talk about some examples of folks who are out here doing the work and what youth who've been impacted in systems are saying about their experiences. And then I even had the opportunity to get information from youth about like what they would like to see changed in systems. So like Cynthia said, we have a lot to cover. And so I'm just going to keep moving forward with what we have for you today. So we're going to define criminalization in a number of ways. And one of the ways is that it is a process by which certain practices that had been legal are made illegal. And sometimes when that happens, there are certain groups that are associated with patterns of behavior. And when those groups become targeted by things that were legal and are now not legal, that means that they've been criminalized, but they've also been racialized, because criminalization is fueled by sexism and it's fueled by racism. And so I wanted to make sure that I, put a number of different information sources out here, because there's so many different ways that we can look at these, and we want to make sure that as we're viewing information, that it is, coming from those who are most impacted, and we're hearing directly from them what's going on. So another thing that I wanted to mention is that the same thing that makes a person, like more likely to become a victim is the same thing, the same situations, the same circumstances that make a person more likely to become criminalized. And so we have to take a really close look. And today we'll be taking a close look at what some of those things are. And then, like I said, later on, just offering out some solutions. And so the next thing I want to do is define victim. And so this definition comes from the Office of Victims of Crime. And the definition is: victim is a person who experiences mental, physical, financial, social, emotional, or spiritual harm as a direct result of a specified crime. And I want to also add that when we are looking at like who's considered a victim, as Cynthia said earlier, we have to look at the ways that youth, people of color, trans folks, we have to look at the way they are coping with victimhood and how that impacts their behavior and their ability to survive in the face of violence. And so a lot of the behaviors that they're using for survival have been deemed criminal. So for instance, if you're attacked and you fought back, that's been deemed criminal. And we can see that in the example of CC McDonald. And so I'll just be like, after I speak, I'll just be dropping in bits of information, of some things that like links to different places and things like that, so that you all can, become more familiar with some of the information that I'm sharing. A lot of it comes from an organization called Survived and Punished. They've done a lot of work on freeing and help to liberate criminalized survivors. And so I want to make sure that I let you all know that this information that I'm relaying, it is not all my work. It is just a culmination of sources of information and interactions that have, brought all of this together today. And so I want to talk a little bit about survivor and the definition. There are a number of definitions, including one from the Office of Victim of Crime, which is one that I'm about to use. And this one says that a survivor is a person who has survived an ordeal or trauma, and that includes being both a direct and indirect victim of crime. And survivor emphasizes the strength and courage needed to survive a traumatic event. And I think by that definition, as I stated earlier, we're all survivors of something, right? And not to water down the experiences of anyone who lives at the margins of the margins. And so when we talk about survivor, we must also include people who have prior arrest warrants and people who have criminal records. And I think that that's one of the things we don't really put together in the gender-based violence movement, like the traditional movement. We have folks who have gone off and, formed programs and organizations to, bring to integrate these systems and the survivor who is criminalized and the survivor who has an arrest record. Like there are people who are merging this information and creating systems so that everyone can be served. But in a traditional gender-based violence movement, we don't hear a lot about survivors and criminalized survivors, particularly ones with records, the ones who struggle with substance use and things of that nature. And we're definitely not having conversations about transgender survivors, intersex survivors, gender non-conforming survivors. Like, we're not having those conversations. So I'm very excited to be having a conversation now. And so some other things that I want to talk about is basically for us to really have an understanding of what the sexual abuse to prison pipeline is, and then also what the school to prison pipeline is. A lot of the work that I do with my organization, Priceless Insight, is around just assisting those who've been impacted by violence. And so throughout the years of doing this work, people who've been impacted by violence, of course, are young people. They are people who live at the margins. And so with their multiple identities, they have a lot more opportunities, and not really opportunities, but more experiences of being harmed. And so I just wanted to just name that. And so when we look at the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, what we're seeing is that there are women who experienced abuse as children and or in adulthood, and that includes molestation, that includes sexual assault, that includes child abuse, that includes intimate partner violence. And so these are the women and the people who are more likely to be incarcerated. And so some of those incarceration rates are also a result of young people, young women of color and young youth of color who have been criminalized through their schools before they've even gotten into a space of being criminalized by the system. And so when we talk about the criminalization within schools, we're talking about youth who are doing just everyday activities, maybe someone in the classroom has not had a chance to eat, and maybe they didn't sleep well last night. And so now this young person who is a person of color is in class, and they are maybe written up. Well, I'm aging myself, because they would call it, getting a referral, or, getting kicked out of class, those sorts of things. So maybe we'll have a person who is not, following the traditional rules of class through whatever circumstances they may be undergoing at that time. And they are instantly, kicked out, or, there's not a system to kind of really get to the heart of what's going on with that student. Their behavior is just criminalized, or it is, just pushed to the extreme. And so when we look at youth who've been impacted by the school to prison pipeline, we're looking at ones who've been kicked out of schools for fighting, young, Black girls having attitudes, or being, oppositionally defiant, are some words that people will describe, the different behaviors that Black girls have that are, ultimately result in them being criminalized. We have high rates of young men who are being criminalized within schools. And because they have, cops in schools, it makes it even more likely that there are going to be records that follow these young people before they even reach a point where they may be impacted by the criminal legal system.
Thanks so much, Annika. That was a great start. Let me just ask an opening question. How many of you have struggled or sort of witnessed, this issue that we're talking about around this failure to recognize certain types of survivors of violence and trauma? how many of you are here today because that's something that you're frustrated by, or you're having trouble grappling with, or your colleagues are having trouble grappling with? Any thoughts there?
Cynthia,
Hi, Cynthia.
oh, sorry. Rebecca has,
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. So Rebecca said, I'm so grateful for this conversation. I can't tell you how many people say we don't work with perpetrators. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great starting point to kind of think about it. And Annika had pointed out, notes for my opening words. The same thing that makes somebody vulnerable to sexual violence by their peers also makes them vulnerable to prosecution and criminalization. And that's a quote from Moira Meltzer-Cohen, a New York City-based attorney who frequently works with survivors. It makes it more likely that they'll be in a position that for their own survival, they may have to violate some laws, and they'll be extremely harshly prosecuted for those violations. And then Rebecca said she's frustrated by the victim versus perpetrator dichotomy. Yeah, Richard, go ahead and jump in, and then I'll come back.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to chime in because some things that just really stimulated some thoughts for me. I'll start with Rebecca's response about the frustration with victim versus perpetrator dichotomy. And that's one of the things that kind of shifted the language that we use at Common Justice, right? We stray away from that term of victim and perpetrator, recognizing that people who have caused harm have previously experienced harm themselves. So we use the term harm party and responsible party, right? To do away with the stigmatization of people's behaviors, which is oftentimes symptomatic of previous experiences of harm themselves. Understand that it's part of that process of healing, that we can acknowledge that in a way that doesn't leave them with that kind of scarlet letter that can lead to some of the things that Annika was talking about earlier, right? Like you being labeled a certain way that you cannot remove that blemish from your identity, and therefore it be justifiable to put you in cages in some of the most dehumanizing circumstances and conditions known to humans. And so I just wanted to add that piece. And I also wanted to add the piece about, I just wanted to respond to just, what Annika was talking about as it relates to the school to prison pipeline, and just my experience alone, working with folks who are in situations where social workers specifically who are working with young folks who are experiencing childhood sexual abuse. My research focused on school social workers who were working with young people who were experiencing childhood sexual abuse and feeling like their hands were tied. One of the things that was the most notable about my research was that, and you all might know this, is that in some instances, you may have a school district with just one school social worker for the entire school district. And they're divvying up their time to several schools, sometimes several high schools, middle schools, elementary schools in this entire district. And they're taught and they're told that their role is not to really provide any clinical therapeutic support, but really like crisis intervention, and with the goal of getting the young person, the child, the student back on track academically. And so what I learned early on in just interviewing these school social workers is that they felt like their hands were tied in many instances. And I say that because I think it's important for us to realize that, folks who are doing this work are well-intended and they come in it with a heart to really provide the utmost support to our young people. But at the same time, some of these systems and institutions are not, supportive of their acknowledgement of the work that needs to be done to prevent things like this, to stoppage that school to prison pipeline and provide young people with the healing support that they need. And then there's some instances in which, even if it's not the school district or the principal, the superintendent of the school district, sometimes it's a parent. And I can share more about that when I get into the, my segment, but I just wanted to chime in and to add that piece. And thank you all.
Thanks, Richard. Can you we didn't have a chance to introduce you. Can you just say a little bit about, you mentioned Common Justice, but say a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, my name is Richard Swift. I'm the National Director for United for Healing Equity, which is the policy and organizing arm of Common Justice. Common Justice is an alternative to incarceration program that looks to advance solutions to address issues of violence without relying on the criminal legal system. My work is mostly outward facing. I'm also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I'm also someone who was formerly incarcerated, someone who actually experienced the school to prison pipeline personally. And so my passion and my commitment to this work, to helping people understand like the complexities of this experience, is rooted in my personal narrative. You know, one of the things that we focus on in Common Justice and what I'm committed to as a person is building a movement to reduce systems of punishment and shift away from this punishment paradigm that is rooted in this idea that people are incorrigible, right? And that punishment is somehow a deterrent, and that, you know, people who harm other folks are therefore deserving of harm themselves. But inevitably, we know that that's not conducive to the healing process, right? That actually drives further violence, right? There's a ton of research that shows that, like, when you hurt, you know, you punish folks, punishment and the punishment system is not deterring violence, it's driving violence, right? It's reinforcing this notion that violence and punishment is a way that you respond to experiences of harm. And one of the things we know is that that's far from the truth, right? We often talk about it, and I'm sure everyone has heard it on this call. Like, we say hurt people, but we also say heal people, or people who are on that healing journey can support other folks on that healing journey. And we see this happening throughout the country when we have these like peer-related models like Credible Messengers, Cure Violence, folks who were previously incarcerated, folks who've experienced community violence themselves, experienced childhood sexual abuse, different forms of violence, who've gone on their healing journey, who are using their stories, their narratives as a means to connect and support other folks who are currently going through that, to prevent them from getting to a place where they feel like they're at their wit's end, or just processing it the way that we naturally process trauma, right? Which is oftentimes like unconscious, and we find ourselves engaging in behaviors that hurts other people. But oftentimes it's just like a defense mechanism. It's a protective measure. It's a survival mechanism that served us at one point. But when we find ourselves in different situations, under different circumstances, it no longer serves us. And you see these types of models taking place quite often. And I'm glad that they're taking win, not only in this country, but throughout the world, recognizing that those who've caused harm and those who've healed from that harm that they've experienced themselves can play a role in helping other people heal.
You see it again and again, and there's such a throughway between, I mean, I think that's why that sort of arbitrary divide between like who's a victim and who's an offender or perpetrator frustrates me so much personally, because you see the throughway of like how people are harmed, and then they end up in the system. And then if they don't get the help that they need, you know, as you were saying, Megan, in terms of thinking about organizations working together, it's so important. And one of the things that I want to push for, and I know others are thinking about on this call, is getting reentry organizations, organizations like Richard's, organizations like Annika's, and rape crisis programs and domestic violence programs working together, so that rape crisis programs and domestic violence programs are more aware of who in their community is someone who is reentering society after being incarcerated and who needs that help. Because so much of the time, the focus of reentry programs is on helping people with housing and food. And sure, those things are really important, but the healing has to be part of that. And a lot of times folks who are reentering don't know where to look. They don't know where to go. And they often don't feel like rape crisis programs are really there for them, especially if they are people who, you know, are not only formally incarcerated, but are people of color, are LGBT, or gender nonconforming. There are lots of ways in which programs can do a better job to make clear that they serve all survivors. And that means really taking a look at how you present your services, how you market your services, who is involved in doing your work, Do you have sort of a meaningfully diverse, team of people coming together on your board, on your staff, in your volunteer network? Are you going out into the community and doing the outreach that's needed to kind of let folks who are formerly incarcerated know that your services are there and that they're available? Someone who does a lot of work with corrections systems, many of which have a lot of those bad actors in them, the power of your involvement is so great, right? When rape crisis advocates get involved, first of all, it helps to shine a light in, I want
to add to, I think, and this is not a popular opinion, but I mean, we can't talk about like the impact of trauma or the efficacy of restorative practices and talk about it within a vacuum, or talk about it only as it relates to a particular group of people. Even when we say like there are certain bad actors, and like we are all human, right? So the fact is like trauma impacts all of us the same way. I just think that unfortunately our system has a narrative about who is deserving of the support. And I think that actually does harm to folks who are the quote unquote bad actors in the DOC or any institution that has the power when they are hurt to perpetuate immense harm on masses of people, because it denies them the opportunity to really reflect on themselves and acknowledge that they have been harmed too, and therefore they need to go through a healing process that will free them and prevent them from causing further harm. You get what I'm saying? Because it's like when you only see a certain person as someone who's perpetuating harm, it's like we're going to allocate all the resources, we're going to focus on them. They have but then those people who are hiding behind their credentials, because it's not only corrections, it's people in the movement, right? It's people with certain titles who are causing harm. But none of us can like go through this experience of life unscathed. We're all susceptible to trauma. And therefore, we're all deserving of the support that we need to heal. And that healing is only going to perpetuate more healing.
That's great. I know you have a particular focus on the youth. Could you say a little bit about that?
Okay, I was in the chat. And so, yeah, I have a lot to say about it actually. So I don't know if we have enough time to cover everything, but I have worked with one particular person who has been criminalized through our system, and I'll just share her experiences very briefly, and then just like open it back up. So yeah, this is Annika who's speaking, and I am working closely and have worked with the Crystal Kaiser Defense Committee. And that is basically a group of community people who have gotten together and said like, hey, we heard about Crystal's experiences and we want to support. And so to have a conversation about what Crystal's experiences were takes us back to 2018, when Crystal met a person who, she met through a dating site, and actually Backpage. So it was a site for people who cause harm, just like a place for them to just kind of hook up with people who are being exploited. And so that's how Crystal hooked up with this guy, and his name was Randy. And so Crystal and Randy basically groomed Crystal. And in the process of him grooming her, Crystal was with a guy and, decided that they were going to get serious. And so there was some discord between Crystal and her current partner, and why she was still being groomed, or air quotes dating, as some places call it, but she couldn't be dating a person that she wasn't even legally allowed to be in relationship with, or consent to sexual activity with, and that's a whole nother story. But anyway, so what was found is that Crystal defended her life against this person, Randy Volar, in May, I believe, of 2018. And so she ended up defending her life because police and the criminal legal system arrested Randy after a phone call was received, kind of one of those criminal mind phone calls, where this young lady's like, this man is trying to, like, he gave me drugs and he's trying to kill me and, come help me. And when police responded to the call, which was made from Randy's house, they found a young Black girl walking down the street with just a top on and some undergarments, and which was, Wisconsin is not a warm climate place, you all. And so when they saw this, they went to his home and found hundreds of child pornography things. He was into Backpage. He was into cryptocurrency. They found a number of the young women that he was targeting, which were all Black girls between the ages of 11 to 16. They found, just all sorts of evidence that this guy had been harming people. And so when it came to Crystal defending her life, she needed to defend her life because this guy was arrested and released the same day. And that absolutely has everything to do with the fact that Crystal was a young Black girl. That absolutely has to do with the fact that in addition to being a young Black girl, Crystal relocated to Wisconsin from Indiana, where her mom was in an abusive relationship. And so, like, Crystal has all of the markers of a person who's experienced trauma, a person who's experienced, like, violence. And then for her to be put in a situation where she needed to defend her life against a person who was preying on her and other Black girls. And now she's facing life in prison because she defended herself. So that's one of the stories that I always want to, make sure that I'm uplifting and just sending love out to Crystal and to the folks who are still supporting her. And, all survivors who are criminalized, because Crystal was indeed a person who falls under that category where she's both a survivor and she's been criminalized and she's been incarcerated and is still on trial for this. So I just wanted to just lift her up.
That's great. Thank you, Annika.
Thank you.
Other thoughts or others who want to jump in to the discussion?
I have, if no one wants to go, there was something that stimulated thought earlier as we were talking about the restrictions that we find ourselves in based on what type of funding sources we get, VOCA funding, what have you, OVC, OVS, what have you. Experiencing that and hearing from so many people that are struck by these limitations and these restrictions and feeling like their hands are tied. It's what drove us to say that in addition to providing services to support the healing journey of people who are underserved and who have not been considered to be deserving of services, right? Because that's the reality. And oftentimes that is driven by a racist analysis, a racist ideology that influences our perception of certain people, right, historically. But in addition to that, it is equally important for us to build the power of survivors, right, to build a movement of survivors that can be committed to survivors who they themselves have experienced the harm, could be in a position where they can define what healing looks like for them and inform these agencies, inform these funders so that we can get the resources that we need to do this work. And I think it's so, because the fact is these systems, these funders, they're doing this work for the purpose of healing victims, but they're not being informed by victims or survivors. You understand what I'm saying? And so it's important for us to organize in a way that allows us to get into spaces, to influence policy levers, to influence people who make major decisions that put us in predicaments where we find ourselves with our hands tied, in addition to providing that direct service. So one of the things that I often talk about is like, we have to have that as well as a social political analysis that informs not only just like our policy and organizing work, but also informs the work that we do with people too, because I found that quite often folks who are well-meaning, folks who are like deeply committed to this work and supporting others. After a while, after experiencing constant bureaucratic red tape, finding yourself with your hands tied, there's either one or two things that I see can happen, right? Either you can start to really focus your efforts and your energy on changing those systems, or it can result in you blaming the victim, right? And it's just this cognitive dissonance that we find ourselves in a way that we assuage that is even, in my experience, is even making one of those decisions. And this is what I found, that you see people who like really go into this work with every intention to support people, and you're like, whoa, how did you get to this place? How do you get to this place where you are just as callous when it comes to the needs of people? You know, I think it's just a human response to almost a seemingly impossible situation, especially those who give so deeply from our heart. So I think it's important for us to have a social political analysis. It's important for us to organize and mobilize so we can change policies, and so that we can get the support that has been defined by the people who've been harmed themselves, and not by folks who just have the authority and those who are sitting in leadership in these institutions.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Richard. I've already had so many moments where I'm like, wow, I'm so glad that I thought to ask Richard to be part of this conversation. This is really important. So one of the things that I want to say about what you're saying in terms of the funding piece is I really want to encourage, and please, you know, those of you here, like, tell me if this is not useful. But I think that one of the conversations, or one of the sort of like analyses that we need to do, is look at our programs. You know, look at, if you're at a sexual assault program, you're at a DV program, you're at a state coalition, and take a look and see where the priority is, and if there is attention being paid to underserved survivors. To really think about, are we working with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated survivors? If we're not, why not? Is it because of a conversation that we need to have with state level funding administrators? Is it a conversation we need to have with our board? Is it a conversation I need to try to have with my ED? You know, what's going on? Because there are things that we can do to try to push some of those levers. Now, Daniel is in a tough situation, being in a state where there has not yet been that kind of decision to say, okay, we're going to lift that, you know, restriction on the VOCA funds. But in a state where that's not the case, really looking at talking to your funding agency and saying, look, put out some solicitations that put the emphasis on underserved survivors and help us to build programs and initiatives to help those survivors, and to build our capacity within our program to serve those survivors, not in a sort of tokenistic kind of way, but in a way where it's not just that one person who becomes the PREA person, for example, but that are, you know, there may be one person who leads the work, but that our staff in general are aware of, have capacity to, and are building on an ongoing basis their ability to serve these survivors. Not just that, you know, I talk a lot about incarcerated and formerly incarcerated because that's the work that I do, but this whole, you know, universe of folks that we're talking about, folks who end up being criminalized, you know, young people, adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, kind of that whole gamut of people who, male survivors. I mean, we haven't even started to talk about male survivors, and in particular, male survivors of color. So, you know, making sure that those resources are there, and that we're not saying, well, we don't really have the ability to take on a new, you know, community or a new initiative, or, you know, we just don't have the bandwidth, and to kind of recognize that, no, all of these people are in fact part of your community. And that goes to that very basic premise that we started with at the beginning, that, you know, this is about not erecting sort of false barriers around who gets to access resources and be on that path to healing. Looking at the engagement with the legal system as being, you know, the sort of focus or priority around healing, or addressing sexual violence, or, you know, whatever sort of violence that we're talking about. when we put the emphasis on healing and really what the survivors need, as opposed to, you know, getting a protective order, getting something prosecuted, having an investigation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really important. I wanted to bring in something that Rebecca said. There's a lot of lip service paid to this, but little action because of boards and who sits on boards, because of funders. Totally agree. There must be policy organizing to put pressure to change this, because executive directors of DV, SV programs and coalitions get fired by boards when they try to do this authentically and meaningfully. So clearly it's hard, and there's a lot of work to do on a lot of different layers. And I know we could all be doing better. I feel like at my organization, Just Attention International, we have really tried to walk that line between working cooperatively with corrections officials, but also being able to call out abuse and being able to call for the sorts of change that's needed. So I know it's definitely a tough line to walk, of sort of partnering, but also being true advocates for change.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, like, you know, one of the things that I learned, so when I came home from prison, you know, my thought was that, you know, like a lot of folks who are formerly incarcerated, is like, you know, like, how can I use my past experiences to support other people, to serve, to help other people heal, and so forth. And it was like, wow, you know, I'm helping people, but the system is still perpetuating the same circumstances that are causing the harm. I did have a systems analysis, but what I didn't have is a methodology or an approach to change these systems, right? I didn't know about community organizing. I didn't know about that, right? And I was like I was relying on the nonprofit space to be like the vessel for the liberation of oppressed people, and that's just not the case, right? And it wasn't until I learned that, you know, you almost have to play this inside-outside game, right? And I started meeting some amazing people at my organization where they started talking about their political home, right? And their political home was separate from the work that they were doing in Common Justice, because even in Common Justice, we're not transformative, right? We do restorative justice work, but we still work with the district attorney, right? And then I had to learn that, like, there are people who are in our space who are not, their value is not aligned with the reformist perspective, that are abolitionists, who don't believe that this is the end all be all, and this is a way to relinquish oppression of people of color, or poor people, or marginalized people, and so forth, who are connected to other political homes like Survived and Punished, like the Movement for Black Lives, like other organizing, base building, like movement organizations that allow you to, you know, do the work, right? Because, you know, people say, well, doing this work is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. My perspective is like, sometimes that Band-Aid is going to stop that bullet wound a little bit. You might just, that's all you got for a minute, and you can put it on there for a second, but you ultimately have to think about, like, what's the next step, right? It's not the end. And I look at that as like the nonprofit sector is like, you know, it's temporarily stopping some stuff or helping some people, but simultaneously we have to do this organizing, movement building, systems change work, right? We have to do that. And there are organizations that are doing it. And I know we have like a list of organizations that we're going to mention, that Annika put together, that Cynthia put together, that lets you know about organizations. And I'm sure you probably all know about organizations in your communities. That's the thing. Identify an organization in your community that can be your political home, that shares your values more authentically than the agency that you're working for. Because it's like putting too much, you're investing too much in your organization as being the vessel for liberation and of oppressed people.
I respond because I feel like I've encountered some of this same struggle in my own work at JDI, this feeling of like, are you actually changing the system, or are you just sort of working within or for or with in collaboration with some systems that, you know, are deeply troubled? And the place that I keep coming back to is that, and I think, you know, I love all of the kind of transformative justice work that's being done. It's just that like today, like at JDI, we operate a hotline that prisoners in Vermont and Michigan can call into. We receive, about 2,000 letters a year from survivors of sexual abuse in detention facilities around the country. So today, there are survivors inside who need our help, our support. And there are also corrections officials inside who need our help, right? Sometimes they're the ones calling those hotlines. And they also need our help in the sense that the partnership that a lot of your organizations can bring in terms of training, in terms of helping corrections officials to understand trauma and the ways in which just day-to-day life inside of, and Annika, you were mentioning this earlier in the chat, the ways in which day-to-day life inside of a corrections facility can be extremely traumatic and triggering for anybody, really, not just for those who are survivors of sexual abuse. And when you think about the very high rates, especially in women's prisons, where about, probably 90% of the women have experienced sexual abuse previously, not to mention what goes on inside the facility, not to mention what goes on when they leave and return to wherever, they've come from or are going to next. That need is so tremendous. And, this work is changing things inside and outside, right? I mean, there has been such a great shift that I have seen with rape crisis programs in these recent years, as you see fewer and fewer conversations about, do we really want to serve these survivors? These are perpetrators, can we really prioritize this? I mean, there's still some of that, of course, but there's definitely less and less of it. And you do see some amazing work going on, some amazing partnerships where you now have more organizations in the community who can call upon each other and provide support when that formerly incarcerated person who maybe didn't get any help when they were inside can now, find those resources so that they're less likely to recidivate, so that they're, less likely to be harmed again and can start that healing journey. So I just want to lift that up as well. I know it's really tough walking that line, and I don't want to sound like I'm an apologist for the system, but just to kind of point that out.
And this is where we're all at, right? We're all in this predicament. So yeah, these systems are made up of people, right? People create and perpetuate these systems. We know that our current systems, unfortunately, have been created and perpetuated by people who are benefiting from the status quo and ensuring that a certain people get the resources, relationships, and services they need to heal. But I do believe, but at the same time, I believe that if we can change the hearts and minds of people to change that. The sad part about it, I think people's hearts and minds often aren't changed until they are directly affected by the same type of circumstances that the people who have been making these cries for years for justice and for equity have been making. And so I think there has to be like multiple pronged approaches to this process of liberation. There has to be work that's done to change the hearts and minds of people. And you got to look at, and the way that I look at it is like, there's certain people who are like on the cusp, right? Who are there where you can like get to them in a way that allows them, like to give them a way out. Because some people are in these systems and they're looking, many of us on this call are in these systems and looking for a way out and looking for an opportunity to really actualize the ideas, the vision, and really put into effect the work that we know needs to be done. And so I think there's folks that they're on the cuffs, that are on the fence that you can push. And there's some folks that are like just ready for it. And they're like already going, like the people who are directly impacted themselves, that you like say go, and they're like, yes, let's make these changes. But then there are some people up here that you gotta push. There's some people that you have to push. And I don't even know if it's like vertical in that way, but it seems like it. But there's some people that you have to push, and they're only going to be moved by force. And that's the unfortunate reality that I find that takes place in our country, and that's been the case historically, that there are folks who you have to push in ways. I like think about the conversations that we're having now about defunding the police, prison abolitionism. Like, these conversations are a direct result of the direct action of the people who took to the streets, where they got to their wits' end and they realized that, like, I'm tired of talking, I'm tired of pleading, I'm tired of, like, because it can't be based on data, right? There's tons of information, there's tons of data, there's tons of research that says that, you know, what we need to be done hasn't been done, and it points out ways that we can do it more effectively. And that hasn't persuaded people, right? And so the folks who took to the streets are like, I'm tired of these pleas. And unfortunately, it took for us to get to a place where there's now a national conversation, right? We're hearing about police forces being defunded. We're hearing about prisons being closed, right? And so I think, you know, it's important for us to know the levels of engagement and the level of interest of the people that we're working with, and that we're trying to move in the direction that we want to move them into, which is the liberation of all people, oppressed people, so that we don't overexert ourselves in ways that it might require less effort, depending on what point they're at.
Earlier, I mentioned that I had an opportunity to gain some insight from a group of youth, and the organization that the youth were from is called Represent. And they basically do their own level of, you know, like direct advocacy work and, you know, outreach and education kind of things. And they also do some system change. And so they've been identifying ways that, you know, the teens most directly impacted can be heard. And in one of those ways is they actually wrote a report. And in this report, from this organization called Represent, and I'll put their information in the chat box, but they said that they would love to see the city and the county, like multiple cities and counties, remove the barriers to funding. So some of the same things we're hearing now. They said that they would like to acknowledge the need for advocacy privilege in community-based organizations, because we've even talked about this a little bit earlier, and especially in the chat where we talked about, like, when you're serving youth, you have certain mandated reporting requirements, and some of those mandated reporting requirements do not like fully serve those most impacted in the best way. You know, like they're pretty much just funneling youth through the system, whether it's foster care system, whether it's the school to prison pipeline, it doesn't matter. It's funneling youth through systems where their behaviors are being criminalized. One of the other recommendations that the youth made was that they wanted staff at these juvenile detention centers to be staff who wanted to be there. You know, they want staff who were concerned, who displayed empathy for them, and like I said, who wanted to be there, because many of them were receiving some of the same punishments for not, you know, like staying in line that a person would receive if they were in a intimate partner violence relationship. And so things like, you know, like the youth would demonstrate behaviors that they use to cope, and then staff at the organization would then ignore them, or, you know, put them on some sort of lockdown. And those are behaviors that continuously punish youth, and that we, like, as Richard said, as you know, like many of us have said, like that approach doesn't work, and we know that it doesn't. So I just wanted to add that, and I know that we have a lot more to discuss. In the chat, I will add some information about organizations who are also doing some work. Oh, and thank you, Cynthia. I see that you've done that. So yeah, I'll just lift up one more organization then, and that would be Soul Sisters. And so with this organization, they have young people who they do restorative practices, restorative justice practices with them. And Soul Sister Collective is located in New York, is located in Florida. And so they do some awesome work.
You've been listening and viewing Elevate Uplift's Community Dialogue series. Elevate Uplift is supported by a collective of national organizations and Circle of Wisdom members leading anti-sexual violence work, and includes the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, the National Organization of Asians and Pacific Islanders Ending Sexual Violence, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the Resource Sharing Project, and our Circle of Wisdom members who provide us with direction, expertise, connections, and influence. For more information, please visit www.elevateuplift.org.